would like to welcome you to Recovering Identity. This is the culmination of a project that's been underway for 3 years, working on the history of Northern Frederick County and basically attempting to find the landscapes, the houses, the memories of the African American presence in the North County from the time of settlement through the 20th century. So my name is Elizabeth Comer. I'm the current president of the Catoctin Furnace Historical Society. And we were thrilled to undertake this grant with ARCH and with Frederick County. And it was funded by the Maryland Historical Trust. And I'd like to introduce Heather Barrett, who's the administrator for architectural research at the Maryland Historical Trust, to say a few words, because without the funding from the trust, this would not have been possible. So Heather and Allison, I should say.
Thanks. Okay, let me get my glasses on. Okay, well, good morning. This is such a good group here on a Saturday morning. Again, my name's Heather Barrett, Administrator of Architectural Research at the Trust. That's the state's Historic Preservation Office. And I'd like to introduce my colleague, Allison Lutheran, our Architectural Survey Administrator. Both of us served as project monitors for the grants related to this project. MHT awarded 2 grants to help fund the project work that you'll hear about today. One was a historic preservation non-capital grant, and the other one was a certified local government grant, both going to the Catoctin Furnace Historical Society, totaling over $75,000. That combination of the 2 grant awards constitutes our agency's largest contribution to a single survey project in recent memory. So very, very good news. Over the last decade or more, MHT has dedicated significant resources to underrepresented and underserved communities, to documenting those communities, including actively pursuing federal grants, such as the National Park Service's Underrepresented Communities Grant and the Civil Rights Grants. We have long understood that our inventory and past documentation efforts often told an incomplete history. Thus far, we've received 8 federal grants to document subjects ranging from civil rights in Baltimore City to Asian American communities in Maryland to Rosenwald schools across the state. The work occurring in Frederick County has been a significant step forward in these efforts, uncovering some of the great resources that you're going to hear about today. The Wolf House on Powell Road in Thurmont is one of my favorites. I won't divulge any details because you'll have to be surprised on your bus tour, but look for that one. This project has also highlighted the challenges of researching aspects of Maryland's heritage that were often suppressed, many times warranting new methods to identify repositories and the keepers of information. The project team was tenacious in their efforts to uncover places and histories tied to African American history in this northern quadrant of the county. We now have 26 new or amended Maryland inventory forms documenting these sites. All of those are publicly accessible through our database. And so I just wanted to take a minute and say congratulations to the project team. Thank you for all of your dogged work and investment, time investment, financial investment. So thank you, and I look forward to hearing the presentations today.
Thank you, Heather. Is this microphone working for me? Oh, perfect. Protein, would you like to say a few words on behalf of ARCH as our full partner in this amazing research? Great.
Hi, everyone. I'm Protein Jabril. I'm president of the board of directors of ARCH Society, which stands for the African American Resources and Cultural Heritage Center. So thank you so much for this partnership. Liz and I have been knowing each other for quite a while. We worked on projects with children in Jack and Jill of America, so it was a natural for us to work with them. Our research committee and team has done a lot of work and still looking forward to more work in the southern part of this project. I'm very excited about this. I'm also excited about our new museum will open soon. I can't tell you the date, but we're excited. I'm down to choosing toilet papers. So this is a big deal for me, writing this RFP and getting that ready, so we're excited about this. I think this part of this project is going to fit perfectly in our research database and room when we have that ready to go. So very exciting times, and continue to look forward to working with the community. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Protein. Yeah, we're so excited about the new Heritage Center for ARCH. Oh,
They want to know where the new Heritage Center is going to be. So it's at 125 East St. Street. It's the lower parking deck of the parking deck right across from the visitor center and next to Sky Stage. So stay tuned, okay? In Frederick. In Frederick, yes. We can open one here too if you want.
that would be great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Protein. We're thrilled. ARCH has been an amazing partner in this research project. So, recovering identity, that's what we're going to talk about today. We have 5 speakers, and then, of course, we'd love to hear from you as well. We're going to start with Edie Wallace, who wrote the amazing context for the North County, for the African American population, and a copy of her context is on the table in the back, and we encourage you to take a look at it. She'll be our first speaker, and then Rob Warner is going to speak about spatial data and how he has mapped and uses maps and uses space to understand people's movement through time. Then our architectural historian, John Murphy, is going to be, he pre-recorded because he unfortunately had a death in his family. He's on the West Coast and couldn't come back east, but very much misses seeing everybody here in person. But we'll hear about his architectural recordation of structures in the North County. And then I'm going to speak again, you're going to see me again, I'm going to talk about our memory landscape, personally my favorite. And then our last speaker, but last but not least, will be Ben Fischler, and he's going to take a deep dive into the historical research that underpins a lot of what we were able to find in this 3-year process. So that's the morning. We will be happy. We're going to take questions, of course. We're going to break at noon, hopefully, if we don't run over for lunch. And then those of you who are on the bus tour, we're going to do a check-in, and the bus will leave at 1. So again, welcome. We're thrilled. You're such a great crowd. And we're going to start with Edie Wallace. So I'll introduce her right now. Edie?
I'm going to try to stand a little bit to the side because I'm height challenged. I may have to stand to this side because I need to keep the slides going. Thank you so much for being here. I don't know that I've ever spoken to a crowd this large. I've spoken to a room with only 2 in it, and 1 got up and left. So this feels great. So I am the author of the historic context for African Americans in northern Frederick County. I grew up in Frederick City, and I probably typical of people in the rest of the county. I had no idea that there were African Americans who had been living in northern Frederick County, and so this was a journey for me as well to see how deep this history goes. And it's very exciting. So what is glasses? what is a context and what is it for? History is a continuing process that is illustrated in the layers of historic material that we call cultural resources. The buildings, sites, structures, and objects, the physical remnants of people from our past. The historic context should reflect those cultural layers and illuminate the processes that influenced them. So how do we write? How do we write an historic context? The National Park Service's National Historic Landmark Program has created a thematic framework for writing historic contexts. Each context documents an important national theme, such as westward expansion, or in this case, the civil rights movement. There are many, many more thematic contexts that we can use to develop history in other areas. So this same kind of thematic framework can be used on a regional scale, such as Northern Frederick County. A regional thematic context might document agriculture in Southern Maryland or industry in Central Maryland, or as we have done for this context, looking at regional history through the thematic lens of African Americans in Northern Frederick County, what I call in my context the Catoctin Mountain, Monocacy Valley region. So although a thematic context might be focused on a particular theme, the context should not be considered narrow. There are many cultural themes that are interrelated, such as industry, agriculture, and religion, particularly here in Northern Frederick County, where the Catholic Church plays a large role in the lives of the residents. The thematic context then identifies these related topics and activities within the region, connecting them to the story of the African American experience. So as we look at the history of Northern Frederick County industry, here represented, of course, by Catoctin Furnace, we talk about the enslaved Africans and their descendants who lived, worked, and died at Catoctin Furnace. And you see a stone there from the African American cemetery. When we review agriculture, we see the enslaved and free black laborers on the larger farms, shown here, illustrated here by Springfield Farm, as well as black landowners who made a living off the land. And that's represented here by the John Sanders Farm near Utica Mills. Religion is an important thread in African American history in general, and here the Catholic Church in particular was a significant presence in Northern Frederick County. Here the church was a spiritual space, but its members and institutions were enslavers as well as employers of free black men and women, and probably children as well. These interwoven thematic threads provide a framework for understanding and evaluating how the historic buildings and sites associated with African Americans in Northern Frederick County came to be and how they evolved over time. So we see Mount St. Mary's University, and St. Joseph's Academy, the historic barns where African Americans were employed. But at Mount St. Mary's, there were enslaved, both associated with the student body and also with the institution itself. So our context follows a chronological development over time and begins with the cultural landscape as it appeared prior to European colonization, covering the prehistoric and pre-contact Native American occupation and their early contacts with European explorers and traders. Woven into this story is the story of enslaved freedom seekers who found asylum in Maryland's western mountains among the Shawnee and Tuscarora tribes living there in the 1720s. So this is a 1707 map that shows actually Piscataway settlement. This is a little earlier. And then there were settlements, the Shawnee were living closer to Cumberland, but villages among them. And then the Tuscarora lived along the Monocacy, hence the name Tuscarora Creek. And I'm showing a picture of a rhyolite point that came from a site in Catoctin Mountain. So from there, we continue through the 18th and 19th centuries, a period marked by the development of the Catoctin furnace iron industry, which dominated the region, covering enslaved laborers, manumissions, and freedom seekers. And these are just a few example documents that we use to develop these stories. On the right, John Bryn, who was an owner of the furnace, his estate account of enslaved people from 1836. The runaway ad for a Negro man named Phil, who ran in 1780 from his enslavement at Catoctin Furnace. And then the manumission of Violet Dugan by Reverend John Dubois at the Mount St. Mary's Seminary in 1819. We also look at free black labor. This is from the 1850 census, listing the free African Americans who were employed at St. Joseph's Academy as washwomen and laborers. And I listed them there because I know there are some family members, descendants of some of the people that are listed here. And then we also look at black land ownership, free black land ownership during this early period. And this is a deed to Charles Lee, who owned a number of properties in the early decades of the 19th century. And then from the 1825 tax list for Frederick County, we see that there were several landowners with multiple acres and buildings. And then the Civil War happened. I say this because if you do history in this part of the country, it's always there. So in the mid-19th century, we come to the Civil War and emancipation, pivotal events in American history that were reflected in the African American experience in this region. The study presents the national context of these events and the impacts they had on the state and local levels and individuals. And I highlighted from an article in June 1863 the concerns about Confederate soldiers going into Pennsylvania and taking livestock, but also taking African Americans, who of course were free in Pennsylvania, and creating concern in the northern part of Frederick County that the same thing might happen. And also the military records for Samuel Brown, who I believe was in the Emmitsburg area, and Lewis Butler. The post-war period, beginning with Reconstruction, focuses on the growth of Black communities in the region amid segregation. Using Freedmen's Bureau records, this one here is a description of the supplies to build the Freedmen's Bureau School in Emmitsburg that later became the Lincoln School and no longer stands. We also use census records, land records, local histories, and descendant oral interviews to develop a picture of the African American cultural landscape into the 20th century. The oral interviews, some of them were older from the 20th century, and some of them were quite current, that Elizabeth, probably some of you here were part of that project, just an amazing amount of cultural memory that was collected through those oral interviews, really important. And of course, maps. When I talk about maps, these are the kind of maps I'm talking about. These are historic maps, 1873 atlas in this particular picture, showing Emmitsburg, the Lincoln Avenue community, that shows where the, quote, colored school is. The Methodist Church became the African American church. There was also a cemetery next to that several African Americans, at least several, were buried in. And then some homes that were owned by African Americans. These maps help us locate these communities and their institutions, most often the church and the school. And these are a couple of other communities, the Poplar Ridge Rural Cluster, I call it, of Black households northwest of Emmitsburg. I circled a couple of the landowners that are African American. Over to the left of that, A. Abbey. He lived back, I can't remember which road that is anymore, but he had a farm farther out. And then the mountain community along Annandale Road, which we'll look at today on our bus route. And then one more map, Pattersonville, which is on the backside of Bob's Hill, named, we assume, after Robert Patterson. Patterson, I believe, owned 25 acres in that area. There was at one time a county school that was constructed for the African American children in that part of the district. You see D.T. Patterson was David Patterson, and I think there was somebody else also living on the E. Nash property, or that might have been the D. So these are the maps that I used. Rob will talk about how he takes that to another level, but he makes use of these kinds of maps and then adds layers. It's fascinating. And then into the 20th century, we conclude with the Brown versus Board Supreme Court decision that began the process of integration, the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and the Ku Klux Klan revival in Rocky Ridge, which some of us remember quite well, concluding with consideration of today's social justice movement. So it's a very wide context, beginning before European settlement or colonization, and then ending in the 20th century, 21st century, with today's social justice movement. We also looked at the African American occupied migrant camp that was located just outside of Thurmont. associated with the Jenkins Canning Company. So the structure of this thematic historic context works well for a regional perspective on African American history, as I've demonstrated, within Frederick County. And I say this because the African American experience and the resulting cultural landscape was and is quite different in the northern districts of Frederick County from that which developed in Frederick City, where I grew up, or in the South County region, where a much larger population of African Americans have lived and worked. That was a legacy of an even larger enslaved population in the past. And I know there are still some active African American communities in South County. So that'll be an interesting outcome and very different outcome when that part of the Recovering Identity project is completed. But for me, it was fascinating to develop this history in northern Frederick County, and I was really happy to be a part of it. So this context developed a comprehensive history of African Americans in northern Frederick County, encompassing a variety of local resources. This study was used to inform the Maryland Inventory of Historic Places survey, which you'll hear about next, I believe, completed by John Murphy, and comprised of resources that retain the physical characteristics representative of the period of African American association, what we call significance, the period of significance, established by this historic context. Many of the resources that we identified during the process of context development were later altered or demolished because the African American population dispersed from this part of the county. For this reason, we created a comprehensive, what we call memory landscape, which you'll hear from Elizabeth about, a list of African American cultural resources in the northern districts of Frederick County that are either too altered to be listed on the inventory or are altogether gone. So we identified sites where these resources would have been. So this is a really important, that's a really important part of the project, and those things developed directly out of what we learned in writing this historic context. So that's it for me. I'm leaving you with some of the sites that we did record during the survey, and I guess next will be Rob. I'm sorry.
All right, thank you very much for being here and listening to the culmination of several years of research. It's really great to see so many people here today. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my role in this project, which it was more like a nexus. I was the bridge between Edie's work and Richard Smith, who is sadly no longer with us, his census research, and the step where we get Elizabeth out knocking on doors and John out doing architectural surveys. So Edie brought in Richard and everybody else that was involved in the early stages had this massive amount of information about African American history in northern Frederick County. And the role that I had, again, was to kind of organize and manage it so that we could get out on the ground and do the work. So to do that, I used a software called GIS. You've probably heard of it before. It stands for Geographic Information System. We use a version which you pay for, but there are versions online if anybody's interested called QGIS. It's completely free. GIS is usually a software. There are primitive forms that are not, computer-based, but it's any system that's used to gather, organize, and manage spatial data. And it does this by connecting a database with spatial data, a map that you can zoom in and out of at various and look at various scales. So, for example, we could come up with a database of property owners, and we could look at the put down a base map, and we could query a question like how many property owners have the last name F that live on the street. So, we can also do more complex analysis. My background is in archaeology, so I'm going to get into where we use it a little bit more in complex situations. So, where we, historians and archaeologists make extensive use of it is here, with the ability to project imagery from historic maps and aerial photographs, and look at precise locations on the ground and compare that with modern imagery, modern maps as well. So this is an example of what I mean. This is an 1890 map drawn by the Sanborn Insurance Company, and it gives us a lot of information, a very good resolution about certain buildings. Now this is in Emmetsburg. Without Edie's information, this is useless. It's just buildings. But we know that along that southern strip there along Lincoln, that all those buildings were inhabited and owned by African Americans at one point. So this is a community, maybe an enclave. Note the other details around it. There's the church at the other end. There is an iron cage at the bottom of the street there, a broad street. Sorry, I can't leave this podium, or I'd point to it. Thank you.
Church.
Yeah. So what happens when we move forward in time? This is 1904. Church disappears. Some of the buildings go away. And as we move even more forward in time, that's a horrible resolution now that I see it on the screen, but that's a 1938 aerial and a 1952 aerial. I just didn't get the resolution right, but you can definitely tell the details as you move forward in time. And now look at the buildings, look at where the church once was, and Elizabeth will be talking more about that in particular later. So this is more along the lines of what I do in general for archaeology, but it is applicable here as well. So the first step of what I was asked to do is to establish the boundaries for the study area so that we could focus in and zoom in on the particular area. So to do that, we looked at an older map because we wanted to use election districts because that's the basis of the census information, which we were getting from Richard Smith. So we knew we wanted to exclude Frederick because that's a project by itself. It was too much information. We wanted to stay west of the Monocacy. So we have two maps at this type of resolution to work with historically, one immediately pre and one post-Civil War, that give details like property owners, where buildings are located, where schools are, and the early road system. So we eventually settled on these early pre-Civil War election districts as our study area. And you can see that there's a few nips and tucks over time, so we went with the earlier boundaries. So as I was pulling this information in, and it was, phone calls, emails, it was going into the GIS, and we had variable levels of details. Some was based on oral history, some was based on maps, some was based on other information. But eventually we got to the point where John and Elizabeth couldn't access GIS in the field. So what we did eventually was to just establish this this database. I think it was Excel at first, and then we just put it into a table in Word. So these tables were talking to each other in GIS, but the information was accessible. And so this information in this form was what went into Edie's appendix in the historic context study. So there's a few examples that I want to show you where doing this, using the GIS-based approach really shined And one of those examples is this, the Williams House, which is southeast of Emmitsburg. Elizabeth had come up with some information. We knew the general area where it was. So I had somebody else that works with us goes to the archives quite a bit, so I sent him on multiple trips to the archives to get all the historic aerial photographs for our study area. And then we geo-rectified them. We knew where they were, where particular elements were on the current ground. So we were looking for a building with a few outbuildings and a barn in the back. We found it in the 1938 aerial. We confirmed with a person who lived there that this was the right place. You'll notice that if you're looking in the present, there's not only are the buildings gone, but the drainage patterns have changed, the roads have changed, the orientations have changed, the fields have become overgrown, so we'd have no idea where this was just by even doing a site visit or on the ground unless we had that aerial to know where it was. Another example, we make extensive use of this in GIS, so I like to talk about it. We use elevation data, digital elevation models. And one of the ways we get very, very accurate models of the surface is through LiDAR. That's light detection and ranging. It's a standard tool for getting these very highly accurate surface models. Basically, it shoots lasers at the Earth, and they come back in the form of a signal, and the time it takes for it to come back tells you how far the surface is from the airplane, which is taking the survey, airborne LiDAR. And so the sheer density of points guarantees that when you're flying over a wooded or forested area, that some of those points, some of those lasers are going to get through to the ground, to the surface. And so we can filter out the trees and we can see what's beneath them without setting a foot on the property that we need to go to. So here's going back to that example. Once we knew where the Williams house was, I looked at the LiDAR data, and you could see that not only we do have an archaeological site here. So there's a cellar hole. We could see the elements of the old drive are still there. Some kind of field boundary demarcating the garden area or the fenced farm area is still there. There's probably more. We didn't go there to find out. But again, without setting foot on the property, we were able to determine that. And I should say that the LiDAR data, the statewide data set is available online for free. One more example, this was really cool because we actually did end up going to this site. This is the remains of Hampton Furnace. We did pay it a visit, and there's a house standing there. You can't see the house because of the way that the filtering out the trees and all that stuff works. So the location is marked on there where the house is. So we went there, we verified that there was slag on the ground. We found all of these elements that were used in the furnace. We verified that there was something there indeed. But looking at it from this perspective helped us establish that spatial relationship between the house and the archaeological ruins that are there. And I should say that this is an important site. I think Elizabeth will talk more about this, but this was one of the first furnaces, the first iron furnace in Frederick County, I believe, to import skilled enslaved labor. And then when Hampton Furnace went under, those enslaved individuals ended up going to Catoctin Furnace. So again, these are the types of maps that Edie showed you, the kind of insets. I just want to bring up kind of an anecdote here where a lot of the properties that Edie had identified, I was able to map, but every once in a while I missed one, I missed an email or something. Elizabeth and Edie were driving around in Thurmont, and they called me and asked where a particular house was, and so I had to find it on the fly. And so you can see up there the H. Williams. We know he was African American. There are apparently some descendants here. This is one of the cooler sites that we identified in Thurmont. Ben is going to talk more extensively about this. But this is just to show you how that works. It just rubber sheeted the historic map over the modern surface and was able to identify the address where the house was. So ultimately, as Heather had alluded to, a lot of these properties that we identify, not a lot of them, some of the properties that we identified ended up going to the MIHP, the Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties. And to do that, we had to create very specific types of maps. There's a couple examples on the screen. We use USGS maps to kind of point out where the property is, and then we provide more detailed maps showing where photos are taken or where boundaries are extended. Again, this is the Emmitsburg boundary increase and the implements barn on the right. And a lot of what came out of that is that we were able to establish some communities represented in the standing architecture in the sites that are still with us. And those are highlighted up there. But there are so many more that Edie identified that are not represented up there Poplar Ridge, just off the top of my head. And there's several more that aren't on there. So we ended up, again, coming at this from an archaeological point of view, I couldn't help but identify the areas that were archaeological sites rather than just standing resources. So we ended up having this hierarchy of standing structures that had possessed integrity. John is going to talk more about that, so don't worry about it too much at this point. But we had standing structures that didn't meet that threshold of having the integrity. We had archaeological sites, we had cemeteries. We also had other sites where somebody just beat us to the punch. Somebody, another organization was in the process of doing an MIHP form or a National Register nomination form. So those sites ended up going into our memory landscape, partially as a product of the mapping and being able to identify where they were. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to people now that kind of use that and ran with the mapping to take it to another level.
Hello and good morning. My name is John Murphy. I'm an architectural historian. I've been working on this project since about 2022. My role in the team is to go out into the field and record the selected buildings and then write up the research. That's both the field survey and the history of the house itself and its occupants in something that's called the MIHP form. I'll be talking about this process throughout the presentation. So for some background, in early 2022, after Edie and Rob had done their research, as you just heard about, there were about 44 potential sites that had been selected. And these were confirmed by property address, tax parcel, as well as ownership records. Some of these had some ground truthing, meaning the team, before I arrived, had drove the roads and looked at them, and yes, there was a building there, but not much more had been done. So my first role getting to Maryland was to work directly with Elizabeth to do what is called reconnaissance. So over several days, we looked at every property in terms of just stopping and looking at the characteristics. Is there a house there? Does it look old? Does it have enough character to it? And then refining the list. So from that list of about 44 resources, we brought it down fairly quickly to a much smaller number. And I'll be talking about those shortly. Now, I think it's time to turn off my camera. Okay, now that I'm on the ground, I apply 4 criteria to what I consider should be a resource that would be recorded with the MIHP. So let's just go through these very quickly. Number 1, is there a standing historic resource? This sounds very obvious, but as Rob said in his presentation, there are a number of parcels or properties that had been historically owned by Blacks, but there's nothing on the ground today, meaning a standing building. So those cannot be included. Number 2, does the resource, if it's found to be there, associate with the theme? And the theme here, of course, is African American history in northern Frederick County. So this project's a little bit different, and often it seemed like a theme or a context in search of a building. My typical perspective is that the building type is identified first. Let's say German barns in Washington County. One would go out and survey those and then write a context about their history, distribution, and evolution. So in this case, we didn't know exactly what was on the ground, but we did have a context. Number 3, and Elizabeth will be talking much more about this in her presentation, does the resource, once you find it, have historic integrity? I will talk about this more in my presentation. And finally, this is key, was permission granted to enter the property? You want to have a willing landowner. You absolutely do not want to trespass. And by doing so, usually that person, if they're in agreement, will give you some free rein to record the property, performing measurements. Sometimes they might invite you inside to look at the cellar or go in the attic. This is really the thing that architectural historian wants to win over for a property owner. And so this is very significant to the resources that you finally select to get the recordation. So as I mentioned, the tool we used, and the tool that's used throughout Maryland, is called the MIHP form, which stands for the Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties. This was something that was established soon after Maryland Trust was formed in 1961, and it works as a research and documentation tool to record a cultural resource, and that could be an archaeological site, it could be an object, it could be a structure like a lighthouse, it could be a historic district, to define their physical features and establish the historical context and therefore significance. Every state has one of these. The form that's used in Maryland is very close to the National Register in its formatting and arrangement. Right now, there's an astounding number of properties that have been entered in the inventory. So as you see on the slide, there are 44,000 plus standing structures and about 15,000 archaeological sites, totaling almost 60,000 recorded resources. Just for fun, I'm calling this the MIHP potpourri, and this is just to prove that things that are recorded are not just churches, schools, courthouses, and the like, but we include here a baseball field, an Oyster Bay boat, an ice cream shop, and my favorite, as the background of the slide, is a crab house. Okay, let's get back to the reconnaissance and those 4 screening questions. This one relates to, is there a standing historic resource? Well, the initial research said, yes, indeed, there was a Black-owned property here, and there was also a log cabin. When we pulled up, Elizabeth, always courageous, knocked on the door and asked about this log cabin, and indeed there is one, and it's partially extant in the basement of the house. So this had to be obviously excluded. Number 2, does the resource associate with the theme? This building looked extremely promising, a 2-story log building on the historic site of a black school in Pattersonville. Now, Elizabeth and I must have dropped by this house 5 times, leaving notes on the door, of which had its own note not to disturb the occupant because they were sleeping. So we never really quite got an answer from the owner. But then Rick Smith, the late great Rick Smith, who was so vital to this project, determined that the schoolhouse that we were thinking of was something like 20 feet away on a separate parcel. So we never got onto the property, even though there may have been an outhouse associated with the school still standing. In this case, we thought we had outsmarted the Thurmont Historical Society. finding Miss Hammond's house on Summit Avenue. We realized, as did the Historical Society, that the original house had burned down, but thought perhaps this bungalow was the result of a rebuild. The current owner of this yellow bungalow was very open to the idea of survey and allowed me in the house, allowed me to take pictures and measurements inside and out. But something struck me as off. The details didn't match what were described in the few newspaper accounts of her home. And then Doug Profiter of the Thurmont Historical Society provided us a trove of material that, along with research of Ben Fischler, who you will hear about later, brought us down to earth. This was not her home. Her home had indeed burned down on the parcel adjacent to the north, just behind that planter. It had never been rebuilt. Number 3, does a resource have historic integrity? Again, Elizabeth will speak on this topic in much more detail later, but the prime filter for evaluating historical significance comes down to, is there enough there in the way of original design, materials, setting, etc.? So when I got this picture as part of the reconnaissance survey, I thought, this is an interesting house. But after doing the survey, I said, no way, this house has lost all historic integrity. Being a little facetious here, it does remind me of an Emmitsburg version of the Brady Bunch house. And to me, in MHT, there was not enough surviving design and material from Milbury's period, the early 1900s, to communicate the theme of Black ownership. This was an interesting case of integrity where the building was literally deconstructing in front of us during the survey. On the right is the picture that was taken during the first reconnaissance. By the time I got to it in March, it had been stripped down to its logs. Now, of course, this is an architectural historian's dream, but my concern was, where was it going next? Number 4, is permission granted to enter the property? Now, we had 2 instances where permission was not granted, and these were great resources, but you have to abide by the property owner's wishes. Here in this slide, Elizabeth is explaining to the neighbor next door that we do have full permission to go onto the Charles Lee Sr. house, an excellent little stone vernacular home. With permission fully granted and no one on the property, that's always ideal. I had plenty of time to rummage around and take all types of unneeded measurements. Here I was poking through the plaster and finding this piece of horsehair binder, which is very indicative of when the house was constructed. This is another case where a current property owner was quite willing to have us look around the house. We didn't go inside, but he gave us full access to the cellar, and we must have been to the house 2 or 3 times. And this is a little bit different in that the house wasn't owned by a Black, but instead was a tenant or leased home. And this is important because initially our screen was only to look at houses and properties that Blacks owned. In his cellar were many diagnostic features of the home's late to early 20th century construction, including this hand-hewn floor beam that was encapsulated mostly in spray foam insulation. So at this point, I'm going to go through some of the MIHPs we did complete. It's going to be a very small number, and they represent resources that I found interesting. You're going to see many more on the road today in the bus, but I'm going to show you ones that you probably may not see or have full access to. I'm going to range them from small to large. In Emmitsburg today, you're going to pass by a 7-foot-high doughboy statue on the west end of town, technically called the Emmitsburg Spirit of the American Doughboy Monument. And you are literally going to zip by. It's a very dangerous intersection. This guy is one of nearly 200 bronze-clad statues. So these are not true statues. They're built up pieces of cheap metal. They're installed across the United States at courthouse squares, parks, cemeteries, and other symbolic locations. They were the design of a very interesting man named Ernest Moore Vicaney. Now you're thinking, what does this have to do with African Americans in northern Frederick County? Well, it's two words with that we'll get to in a second. So just a little background on the Doughboy statue, or this particular brand of the Doughboy. Vicaney, who you see on the left, was the ultimate huckster type who knew his market. He was from Indiana, and his father was a French immigrant stonecutter, that is, someone who makes funeral memorials, and his son picked up the trade and joined a monument making company and was making grave markers up until the end of World War I. At that point, he quickly understood the patriotic impulse to recognize the boys coming from over there. And essentially, he ripped off someone else's Doughboy statue and started making them, reproducing them very quickly as 12-foot high statues from his friend's car dealership. By this time, he had moved to Americus, Georgia. It was a very lucrative business with a kind of a drama of trademark infringements and counter lawsuits, etc. Vicaney is the story of going from rags to riches and rags back to riches, and finally he committed suicide in October 1946. Back to those two words. The left image is the plaque affixed to the front of the Doughboy Monument in Emmitsburg. It alphabetically lists all the soldiers who fought in World War I. But at the very bottom of the plaque, in a segregated area, under the name Colored Soldiers, are the 3 African American servicemen who also fought in World War I. Emmitsburg is not alone. On the right is the same arrangement, under a different Doughboy statue in Funkstown in Washington County. This was common in the Deep South, where sometimes black servicemen were completely left off war memorials. The only exception to this typical reaction of segregation, exclusion, is the Victory Monument on the left. It was erected in Chicago in 1927 and consisted of a classically inspired marble shaft placed at the center of a prominent intersection. Interestingly, in 1936, it received its own black-themed Doughboy, the first of its type in the country. As part of this project, I've also looked into a black Doughboy that was applied to a shaft. It's not a three-dimensional figure, but a bas-relief figure in Concord, California. The image on the right is the Emmitsburg Doughboy after it was struck by a car in 1973. It was struck again in 2015, coincidentally the same night as a deadly shooting at an African American church in Charleston, South Carolina, killing 9. Both times the plaque bearing the soldier's name had to be replaced. There was an opportunity to fix this injustice, which was called out by a local elected official in Emmitsburg, but the 2 Emmitsburg area veteran groups opposed. One member expressed their sentiment as, "That's the way it was back in those days, and that's the way it should be." One of the group's members, a black veteran, agreed. To him, it was important to show how segregation existed, even in memorialization. And so the plaque reads as it was created in 1927. Moving up in size, this is the Patterson-Willard property. This is not a house you're going to see today. It is a long walk from the road. At the end of that path stands Robert Patterson's very small house. Later, it was the home of an independent mountain woman named Alice Willard, who kept her own still on the property and once worked as a fire watcher at the nearby Foxville Tower. The story of Frederick County's role in goldfish raising in the early 20th century is pretty well known. But not much is known of the story of Eli Wolf, a black farmer who got involved in goldfish mania and was a major breeder for a time. America's fascination with the goldfish started in the late 19th century after the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. There, thousands of people had seen rare examples of Japanese goldfish sent by the government. It first started as a hobby of the rich, as shown on the left, and by the 1920s became a fad with goldfish swallowing. Eli Wolf, the only known African-American goldfish breeder in Frederick County and perhaps Maryland, was born on May 6, 1883, to parents Calvin and Ruth Wolf. At 18, according to the 1900 census, he worked as a day laborer, probably on a local farm. He later became a trucker and farm helper. By 1920, he was ensconced in goldfish breeding, with this year's census identifying him as a pisciculturist, that is, owning his own farm to raise goldfish. Eli and his wife May were professional goldfish breeders, but nothing has been written of their operation. They are not mentioned in local newspaper accounts, but a 1929 Bureau of Fisheries publication, seen below, lists him, Eli, as one of the leading goldfish breeders in Maryland. Eli's property is closely related to the Wolf House, or the Calvin Wolf House, his father, on the other side of the highway. You won't be seeing this property today. On the screen is a photograph of the family assembled in front of the Calvin Wolf home. The bottom right-hand corner on the porch, you'll see a gray can. This is one of the goldfish carrying cans that Eli and May used at their operation across the highway. I'd like to thank at this point Patricia Snowden, who is pictured in the photograph in pink with her arms crossed, for giving us all her knowledge on the Wolf family operations. This is the largest building we looked at. The implement barn or implement building associated with the old St. Joseph's Academy Farm. Erected between 1898 to 1904, the implements barn was one of nearly a dozen agricultural buildings that serviced the Academy's farm. Only 2 of these survive today. John Briscoe, a teamster, would have likely visited this building on a daily basis. The image below is the loft area on the 2nd floor, representing nearly 5,000 square feet of space. It is arranged into mini bays which historically stored hay and grains that were fed to the animals. The 2 images below illustrate how historic maps can inform a survey and research. Both of these were supplied by the Daughters of Charity Archives. Before getting these maps and a few others, we knew little about this building. These maps helped us understand the building's name, its use, its construction date, and how it evolved over the years. Touching upon something that Rob Warner said earlier, we relied heavily on historic aerial photographs to get a better understanding of this property. They again showed us how the building related to other agricultural structures on the land, the field arrangement, making a guess of what was being grown, and then comparing to today how this farm has mostly been erased from the landscape. And finally, the largest resource of the completed MIHPs. A 7-house block along West Lincoln Avenue in Emmitsburg that was considered to be a survey district. We first looked at this house, the Snell Brown house, with the idea of making a historic district, but something got in the way: its provenance. Going back to question number 2, does this resource associate with the theme, or the context in this case? The initial answer was no. Initial archival research identified that 5 of the 7 homes, or their lots, historically had black ownership. However, 2 in the center, adjacent to each other, including the one just shown, were not, and this caused a problem in the way of establishing a district. We initially finished our MIHP form with this understanding that there would not be a historic district. However, Edie looked at it again over the months and established that the two houses we initially thought only had white association were indeed black, changing the idea of where we could go next. We now had something we could potentially work with, a line of 7 buildings historically associated with black ownership that could qualify as a small district, or better yet, be added to the National Register District of Emmitsburg. This district, long established, incorporates basically the entire older part of town. We reworked the district idea and petitioned MHT for a boundary increase to that National Register district. With the help of staff, MHT staff, it was added to the National Register just recently on April 8, 2024. I would like to thank at this time the oral informants from the street that helped us immensely in putting this together, and that would be Marie Williams and Debbie Smith. I see I've reached my 20 minutes. Thank you for your attention and have fun on the bus tour today.
So we're going to continue now with the memory landscape. So let me explain why we have a memory landscape in our study. This was never part of the scope of work, but then we never take anything, we always go above and beyond. Let's just put it that way. And so we realized that I had gone around knocking on so many doors and finding all these amazing structures. And as an archaeologist, I look at history through the layers of history. So I don't sort of say, well, this prehistoric layer is more important than this 1890 layer, because that's not, they're equally important. And so looking at architecture from an archaeological point of view, which I'm sure drove the architectural historians absolutely crazy, we realized that we had all of these structures that didn't, quote, qualify for a full MIHP recordation. However, we were not going to lose these structures as part of understanding the North County and the African American experience here. So Edie and I, well, the whole team were like, what are we going to do? We're not losing a single property. So we made a memory landscape, and that's what you're going to hear about now. So a memory landscape is just that. We've been able to record structures that either were didn't have enough integrity architecturally, as John Murphy explained, because of the changes that have been made in the 20th century by non-African American owners. Or they're structures that already had a recordation, in this case, Springfield, but yet we're including them because they are part of the North County. And in order to understand how people lived in the North County, how they moved through the space, how they interacted with the land, we needed to include all of them. So that's what we did. So this is the James Johnson House. It's Springfield, that's its historic name. You probably know it as a winery and brewery and distillery now. It is a fabulous building built in 1775, but we're not talking about it because it's a big house. One of the testaments to the wealth and privilege and prosperity that Catoctin furnace and the skilled enslaved ironworkers produced for these owners. We're talking about it and including it because James Johnson enslaved more than 70 people on Springfield, on his property. There were apparently 7 springs, one in each field, and it was part of what we call the agrarian lands to feed the population that was at Catoctin. So this is where the animal husbandry was. This is where crops were were produced to feed the population. Auburn, another one of the mansions, and if you come to the Museum of the Iron Worker and you stand around our map on the floor, the first thing we point out to you is that Catoctin is ringed by mansions. And these are mansions in 2024, so dial back 200 years, they are enormous mansions. And not only did they have the mansions that surrounded Catoctin, but they also went to Frederick and built the mansions on Record Street and Council Street. So, lots of money made, and that power and prosperity continues today. Just so you understand, we had the first governor of Maryland, Thomas Johnson, was an owner of Catoctin. Louisa Johnson Adams was first lady. She married John Quincy Adams. And the current president of the EU, Ursula von der Leyen, is a direct descendant of John Bryn, another one of our owners. So even in 2024, Catoctin, little Catoctin Furnace has, and the wealth that was made by the enslaved, skilled iron workers is still extant in the world today. I digress. Auburn, another one of the mansions that surrounds Catoctin, the home of Baker Johnson. He had a number of enslaved and was, it's just off Route 15 at Auburn Road. This was a really interesting project or finding, and I've gotten to know every chicken at the William Johnson farm called Hayland. William Johnson Baker Johnson gave Hayland and a number of enslaved to his son William. What is really interesting about this property now is that we, using our groundbreaking DNA research, we have connected the Summers family, who live in Hagerstown, through a burial at the cemetery to Wally, who was enslaved at Hayland by William Johnson. And then additionally, George Brooks gained his freedom when he joined the Union Army in 1863 from William Johnson's property. This was a 22-room log structure, which unfortunately had a number of 20th century fires, and then eventually the owners did take what was remaining of the historic house down and built a new house on its footprint. But Hayland, again, it's a memory, it's part of our memory landscape. The Castle House on Blacksmill Road, and on some of these I'm going to talk about the roads, and some of them I'm just going to talk about the areas. This house, built by Jacob Christ, it was a 413-acre hardest fend-off tract, and he held 6 people enslaved on the farm. Unfortunately, this house is now in very poor condition, but it is, again, part of our memory landscape. The Zimmerman House, also on Blacksmill Road. So this is, just to orient you, this is between Creerstown and Catoctin Furnace. George Zimmerman established this farm in 1768. He had 4 enslaved people, and then the Zimmermans owned it, and it is quite a large log structure on Blacksmill Road. Of course, you're, I hope, familiar with the Catoctin Furnace Historic District. The enslaved Africans from Hampton Furnace and from Green Spring came to Catoctin, were brought to Catoctin, built the furnace, worked as skilled iron workers there until approximately the 1840s. And there were, we'll talk more about Catoctin, but it's obviously the largest enslaved industrial place of industrial enslavement in Frederick County. Vallenay, also known as Windy Hill, is another one of the mansions that rings Catoctin Furnace. This one was built with the profits from the War of 1812 by Willoughby Maybury, and he had his Negro man named Daniel among his personal property, and then he had free black domestic servants at Vallenay. The Henshaw Buzzard Farm, which is on Kelly Store Road, you can see in the bottom the ruin of the house, and the barn above it is a magnificent barn. But Tup Lucas, who was Amos, known as Tup Lucas, who became a barber in Thurmont, was brought to the area from Loudoun County, Virginia, by the Henshaw family, and then he was at this property on Kelly Store Road before he moved into downtown Thurmont and opened his barber shop. Continuing in the Craigerstown, we have the St. John's Church. This church had records show 9 African American members, and the brick church is still standing. You'll see it today on the tour. And the adjoining cemetery has several black burials, including the Butler family and Nancy, Mary Norris, and Ruth Bowie. And you'll hear more about the Butlers and Ruth Bowie when we get to their actual memory landscapes. Also in Craigerstown, the Union Bethel Church of God Cemetery has at least one African American, Betty Smith, who died in 1904, probably more, but we've been able to document one. John told you about the implement building, constructed between 1898 and 1906. We really did a deep dive into John Briscoe and his father, James, who were employed by the college and we could sort of just, I can see them moving through that implement barn on a daily basis and taking care of the animals and the equipment for the facility. Also in Emmitsburg, St. Euphemia's School. We know that there was a separate room for the African American students in the school, and the staircase and a lot of the other interior features are still very intact. So it is quite a find to be able to document that. Peter Burkett owned half interest in a merchandise store in Emmitsburg. The building was still standing in 1951. It's now PNC Bank, but again, part of the memory landscape. Anthony Bowens, a free African American, purchased Lot 127 in Emmitsburg in 1814. Unfortunately, this structure does not date from his ownership, so it wouldn't qualify as an MIHP, but again, part of the memory landscape of Emmitsburg and the population. The Emmitsburg Shoe Factory, Willie Van Brackle, was the first African American to be employed at the Hanover Shoe Factory, and it closed in 1985. This is part of our very extensive oral histories that we've done. So basically, Ronnie integrated the Hanover Shoe Factory, which is now the Emmitsburg Antique Mall. So every time you go in there, think of him. John told you about the World War II Doughboy Monument, and yes, that opportunity to correct the, make everyone the same, if you will, on the plaque, has sadly not been undertaken, even though it's been hit twice and they've had to redo it twice. So the Van Brackle Whedon House on North Seaton in Emmitsburg, apparently, according to our oral histories, when Mamie Eisenhower, because that was the main road to go to the Eisenhower farm from Washington, D.C., she stopped and admired the garden that Mamie Van Brackle had at her house. So the house has been altered, again, by white ownership, so doesn't qualify for an MIHP form, but definitely for our memory landscape. The John Hughes Cabin, which is on the property of the Grotto and Emmitsburg. When it was being built, it was likely constructed with, or very likely, almost certainly with enslaved labor, overseen by Father Dubois. You saw John talking about the people that were enslaved by the Dubois, by by the college and Father Dubois. The St. Anthony's Church and Shrine Cemetery, you saw that wonderful image that pointed out the graves. That's Rick Smith's amazing, amazing, amazing research to find those names and link them. So the largest number of African American burials of all the cemeteries in Emmitsburg, and they were segregated at a very low level until Mr. Williams' burial took place in 1960, and it became integrated. Dubois Hall, which you'll see today on the Mount St. Mary's campus, enslaved people were housed in the basement, and we also have extensive oral history about people working in the kitchen and in the laundry as well at the college. Marie Williams's house on Old Frederick Road. This house is on, Rob talked about this with the LiDAR survey and the aerial photography. There was a barn behind the house along with a chicken house and outbuildings, and the Williams family lived there until they moved to Lincoln Avenue after Mr. Williams's untimely death. The Stephen Green property, that is a new structure, as you can see, but he was the first enslaved person freed by Mount St. Mary's Seminary, and he purchased this lot very early, 1837. He lived with his still enslaved wife, Susan, and the children until he was able to purchase their freedom. And this is, again, part of Edie's amazing research. And it remained under Green ownership until 1875, and the current house was built in 2000. We were a little too late on Annandale Road because in several instances these houses did disappear, the historic houses did disappear within the last couple decades, but that's why the memory landscape and keeping this information is so important. John talked about the Abraham Lee house. I was so disappointed because I had found out that the log superstructure was still inside, and the basement was also indicating that. But again, it has been altered so dramatically by non-African American ownership that it wasn't able to be MIHP, but it's a memory landscape. John talked about the Mountain Log House, and it is just a really cool building that is actually being restored very well. I just drove by it, and you'll drive by it today as well. The Lewis Green House, again on Annandale Road. He was living there with his two of his 4 children, and then he sold it in, Osborne Green sold it in 1938, and the current house was built circa 1970 on Annandale Road. The Martin Lee House, which is a historic house, 22-acre parcel. It had a barn and a spring, and it was this was one of several structures where the last will and testament of the African American owner said that the Sisters of Charity could take the property if they wanted, but apparently they chose not to. The Abby Richardson Williams house. This is a really interesting house because the current owner, Richard Williams, the grandson of William and Marie Butler Richardson, they were able to tell me exactly where the historic structure sat behind this current, this newer structure, and what it looked like, where the logs were taken up in Pennsylvania, the chestnut logs. But it's still, the important thing is that while the historic structure is not there, its setting is, and this is still an African American owned structure. John talked about the Charles Lee House. This is a fabulous, fabulous stone structure, and he purchased the land in 1813. So this is really early in Annandale, on Annandale Road, and it's very little changed, very little changed. Very important property. The Thomas Martin Lee House. Again, this was another one that was given it was occupied by John Tyler, who was white, but it was given in his will, it was given to the Sisters of Charity, who appear again to have declined the offer. But we need to actually go to St. Louis and look at more records to, to sort of finish out this story. But there was another dwelling here, and this is at the corner of Crystal Fountain and Annandale, and there's part of that enclave of the mountain, what we call the mountain area. The Stephen Lee and Annie Mitchell house, this is on Crystal Fountain Road. The Mitchells owned it. Ruth Mitchell moved to New York City, and then the property was sold to a white owner, but it is again an African-American dwelling. The Robert and Annie Mitchell property was apparently, it's a log structure on Crystal Fountain Road, moved from the campus of Mount St. Mary's. Really interesting property, beautiful woodwork, beautiful log inside, but it's, again, a memory landscape property because of its lack of integrity. The Robert Watts property, again, in Emmitsburg, African American. The historic structure is now gone, but the memory landscape remains. The Charles Craig House, right off Hampton Valley. This was a property, a 1-acre lot that was owned by and lived in by African Americans. The Stouters own it now. This is the Letty Myers house, again in Emmitsburg. This was owned by an African American family, Jerry Myers and his wife Charity and his daughter Letty. Letty inherited the property in 1848, and then it was sold to a white family. The Coates house, in the will of Stephen Coates, he purchased this property in 1833, and then he had 4 acres. This is in the Poplar Ridge area. It passed down through the Coates family. That structure, as it stands now, is a new structure, newer, 20th century, but again, it's part of the African American landscape of Emmitsburg. The Butler property, which is basically on the Pennsylvania line, was a property where the Butlers ran a trash business on Irishtown Road until they sold the property in 1961, and there's a modern house now on that property. The Jane Bucket property, a 1-acre lot on Flat Run. This gentleman, a white gentleman who owns this structure now, was able to tell me that it was obviously a very, very modern structure, but the tree was there when the log house was taken down. They left the tree, so that tree is part of the African American landscape of the north of Irishtown Road. So we talked about Hampton Furnace. This is such an important find for us to understand that enslaved Africans, as well as all of the equipment, was sold by the owners of Hampton to Catoctin when Catoctin was starting up in the 1770s. The furnace at Hampton seemed to be a great plan. It had a great water source, but they had no iron ore. So they started hauling the ore from Catoctin Furnace all the way to Hampton Valley Road, which would have been, well, unsustainable, and in fact it was. So they shut down Hampton and then used it as a grist mill and a sawmill. The Emmitsburg Methodist Episcopal Church and Cemetery is now a swimming pool. And when I was speaking with some people in Emmitsburg, they're like, oh no, there was never a cemetery there. And I'm like, oh yes, there was. And here's the evidence of it, because we have a burial, a recording, if you will, a newspaper clipping of the burial. But unfortunately, this, Rob showed you those fabulous maps of Lincoln Avenue and this church and cemetery. And again, Rick Smith found this first. He definitely was the person that found that first. The Brown Whedon House, this is part of the boundary increase. Again, Peter Brown purchased it from his employer, David Gamble, and it it passed through several black owners, ending with Richard Whedon when he sold it in 1959. And the Wallace Chase Smith House, also on Lincoln Avenue, African American, the colored school was here as well in what is the side yard, and that school is unfortunately no longer standing. The Constant Richardson House on the southwest edge of in Lincoln Avenue. We've gotten some really great oral history from this, from the current owners who remember purchasing it from the African American families and living there. And then the Snell Brown House. In around 1880, James Snell, listed on the 1880 census as mulatto, purchased the house on the west half of Lot 56 from David Gamble, and it passed out of black ownership in 1923, which again is not fits into the context that Edie was telling you of the sort of exodus, if you will, of African Americans from the North County. The Williams Brown Burkett House, which is the Marie Williams house now, again, historic African American structure. The Brown family occupied the house until 1962, and in 1963, the Williams family purchased it. The Clarence Van Breckel House, again on Lincoln Avenue. Clarence Van Breckel purchased it in 1941, and it was initially a log cabin. This was a really interesting oral history that we were able to do. Clarence moved it to the site using a VA loan. He upgraded it, and he increased the height to 2 stories. He put in an indoor bathroom, and it was sold out of the family in 1993. The Hetty Parker and Gertrude Downey house on West Main Street was originally a white school, and this was so confusing. We went down so many rabbit holes on this one. But Hetty Parker rented the building as early as 1900. She purchased it in 1904 and then sold it to Isaac and Gertrude Downey, so it remained African American right up until 1964. The David and Harriet Hill house next door, right on West Main. Now, this is a property that was not owned by African Americans, but the tenants were African American. Again, West Main. John told you about the George Abbey house, and again, that was a tenant house. The Emmons owned basically Emmetsburg, and so they rented out a lot of structures. And there's an enclave on West Main Street there was, pardon me, an African American enclave, not just on Lincoln, but on West Main in Emmetsburg. Here's the Mary Milbury house. Again, this was African American, did not, as John said, have enough integrity to be an MIHP, but Mary Milbury was a widow. She purchased this lot from Isaac Annan, and then she lived there. She built the 2-story frame house, and she then transferred it to her children. The Gem Cinema, Willie Van Brackle, he told me that he integrated it in the late 1940s or early 50s. He would go to the cinema with his white buddies, his friends, and they would say, okay, well, you can sit in the front, but Willie had to sit in the back. And so Willie said one day, I'm sitting with my friends down front, and from that point on, African Americans sat wherever they wanted. It closed in 1964 because they showed beach blanket bingo with Annette. This is why I love oral history. With Frankie Avalon and Annette Funicello, and the Catholic Church said enough of the Gem Cinema, and it's now apartments. True story. I checked it out. The Emmetsburg Canning Factory. Barbara Van Brackle Whedon and Willie Van Brackle remembered their mother working at the canning factory on Route 140 on West Main Street after their father's death. And the long gray building drew workers from all over. And then once it shut down as a canning factory, they became a manufacturer of men's clothing, and they demolished the building in 1980. The Sunshine Trail has been, a local lore has identified the Sunshine Trail as a route on the Underground Railroad. This is one of these questions that requires further research because we did, in fact, after 3 years, run out of time and money. At about the 1 year left. Anyway, whatever. The Harrison Log House on Sugar Tree Farm. Slim Harrison has told us that he was told by Clyde Kipe and Heidi Wilhide that there was an Underground Railroad association with this spring house, and there is a graveyard on this property. I've been there, and there are a number of headstones. You heard about the Eli Wolf House. Goldfish farming in the black goldfish farming success, and the Eli Wolf family is a example of that. And oral history from Patricia Snowden has been very helpful with that. And John also told you about the amazing Wolf House, which is on the back against Fishing Creek off what is called Powell Road, or it used to be Bowers Road and now Powell Road. We're in Lewistown, by the way. I mean to skip from Emmitsburg to Lewistown and not tell you. This is Patricia Snowden's house, the Holiday Snowden house. It is more than 50 years old. It is black owned, and it was built in 1952 by the Wolf family. The Ephraim Richardson House, again on Powell Road. There's an entire enclave of African Americans on, or were on Powell Road in Lewistown. And one of the things that I found was that, the owners of Catoctin owned all the land, 12,000 plus acres. So if you wanted to get away from Catoctin, or if you gained your freedom, or you wanted to become, a farmer, the closest place you could buy land was Lewistown. It wasn't Thurmont, but it was Lewistown. And so this probably is why we see an enclave with a church, a school, a cemetery, and then all these houses along Powell Road. On Powell Road, there is a burying ground. There are stones. Again, Rick Smith found this. The Benjamin Flowers purchased lot 132 at the Richardson tax sale and sold it sometime before 1874. And unfortunately, it's being used as a parking lot, but there are gravestones there. We do not know who's buried here, unfortunately. The Colored Emmy Church, the Freedmen's Bureau School, and the county school here, not this building, but on this lot in the corner. And I was in this building over and over again on the phone with Edie and John going, okay, here's what I see. I'm not an architectural historian, but here's what this stone looks like, and here's what this log looks like, and yes, it's hand-hewed, or no, it's not, and da-da-da-da, circular saw. Anyway, unfortunately, it looks like the structure is gone, and now this building has been heavily modified, but on the property there was the county school as well as an earlier church which housed a school for black children sponsored by the Freedmen's Bureau. So near Lewistown, between Old Frederick Road and Wilhide Road, near Stevens Road, there is the Henry Butler Farm. Henry Butler purchased 2 acres on Hunty Creek in 1842, probably built a log home. He was living there next to a mill, and you still can see, this is going to be on the tour today, you can still see not Henry Butler's property, or not his structure, but the large mill house that was associated with the mill. William Butler, in the 1873 Atlas, and in 1880, it shows William Butler as a farmer living near the woolen factory, which was where the mill was, and then he is buried, they're buried up in Kriggerstown. Ruth Bowie lived to be 101, I think. She lived, and I have descriptions of her log cabin with quilts hanging down the walls from Patricia Snowden, who would go there. And the Daughters of Charity would go to Ruth Bowie's house on a regular basis, taking her food and supplies as well on the old Lincoln Highway, quote unquote. The structure is not there anymore. It's a modern house. Right here in Thurmont, we have the Weller Johnson House at 27 West Main Street. Jacob Weller blacksmith had this large stone structure, and you can see that there is a painting of an African-American girl done with lamp black on the landing that goes up to the attic. There were African-Americans living there. George Johnson, a merchant, had no relation to the Johnsons at Catoctin. This Johnson was from Connecticut. Anyway, he had one free black man in his household named John Brown, who was a cooper, and he also had, there were 3 enslaved African-Americans early on when it was owned by the Hammonds. The Jenkins Brothers Canning Factory, also here in Thurmont, seasonally employed migrant workers. I remember as a child the children of the migrant workers coming to school for 3 weeks, approximately, sometimes maybe 4, in the fall when the canning season was taking place, and the factory closed down in the 1970s. And the cannery buildings no longer exist, but we know exactly where they are, right by the Weller Cemetery. The Weller United Methodist Church and Cemetery, when Holdcraft did Names in Stone, he put the wolves in his inventory. He didn't realize that they were African American, but Patricia told me she remembered as a very young child going to the funerals, and she described where the cemetery, where the stone was, and of course it was right there when we went to look. And Tup Lucas is also buried there. Leonard Pickings Colored School on East Main Street here in Thurmont. It is, when I was a kid, this was a laundromat. Now I believe it's a tattoo parlor, but, okay, all right, great. Well, but it was a school for black residents. It was not for children, it was for all ages. That Mr. Picking wanted everyone to learn, and he was able to put it in a summer kitchen behind Judge William Black's structure. We had hoped that this structure still was extant, but it unfortunately is not. But again, the landscape is there, the memory landscape is there. The Thomas Gaunter House was also in Thurmont, just near the railroad track. And this is a family that we've been searching for because the descendants of Emma Gloria Little knew that their ancestor was a domestic in Thurmont, but they just didn't know where, and we were able to find it. The Hendricks House is now Criswell. It was Henry Hendricks purchased 4 acres in 1861, another 1.3. This is literally right around the corner. In 1867, he was there with his adult son, and then he lost ownership. He defaulted on it, and we saw this over and over again. But part of this was predatory lending, obviously, and or not just part of it was predatory lending. But anyway, the house was demolished, and the property is now the car dealership. Thomas Smothers built this house, purchased this lot in 1864. So this is right, as the war, was ending. But then somebody was asking earlier, where did people go? This family moved to Baltimore. We know that. And so here's Tup Lucas, the barber in Thurmont, who, according to his obituary, was the only African-American in Thurmont, which I think is actually, I don't have any reason to doubt that. I think that's absolutely true. His barbershop was right beside, it's an empty lot now, but it's just, if you know where the Thurmont Historical Society is, it's just toward the square from there on the same side, and that's where Tup had his barbershop. The Henry Williams houses, it's not just one, it's 2. We're showing one here, the other one is next to it. In 1870, Henry Williams was listed on the census, aged 48, as a farm laborer living in Mechanicstown with $300 in real estate. He was identified with a house on the lot in the 1873 census, and then he purchased the lot, and he described it as his dwelling, so we know, we believe he was living there, and it appears that he constructed another dwelling on the other half of the lot, sold that in 1881 for $550, making a good profit, and then in 1883 he sold the remaining house and lot, and he moved to Frederick. But his houses, his beautiful log houses, still stand side by side. The migrant camp in Thurmont is, again, over by the railroad track near the Weller Cemetery. The migrant families, mostly African Americans from Belle Glade in Florida. And we just need a grant. Somebody needs to go to Belle Glade and find out who there still remembers coming to Thurmont as a child and what that was like. So if anybody, we have a lot of little pieces of this research that would be fabulous for somebody to grab and go with. They lived in very dilapidated housing. This housing was horrible, 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 horrible. And they attended the local schools during their stay. Miss Hannah Hammond, I remember Miss Hannah Hammond. She was a member of Harriet Chapel, the Episcopal Church in Catoctin, Furness. She worked in the rummage sale as a volunteer, along with the mother of Father Schwint, who was the Episcopal priest when I was a child there. Before she died, she gave my mother her doll. And she said, I know, Miss Betty, you'll take care of it. I don't want the family, the Hammonds, to have it. And so after my mother's death, we donated it to the Thurmont Historical Society, where you can see it. But it was her prized doll. We have, as John said, we traced Miss Hannah all through Thurmont. She lived above the bank in an apartment, and she also lived, according to the Tresselt family, behind their father's house on East Main Street. And here she is again with her doll and a photo of her, and then this wonderful newspaper clipping about the tea that she hosted and who attended the tea. Now, I find this tea really interesting because it's right after Pearl Harbor. And it's almost like, I don't know if Miss Hannah wanted to show, solidarity for, the Europeans and the British, but she hosted this tea, and it was written up in the newspaper. More business forms. Ronnie Van Brackle, his brother Ricky, and their aunt Mildred Van Brackle-Weeden were the first African Americans to integrate the workforce at More Business Forms. It's now called R.R. Donnelly right here in Thurmont. So wonderful memory landscape. You heard about the Patterson-Willard House, which is just a fabulous resource. Again, you can't see it from the road. It's a very long walk in. And I will say, according to Gideon Willard, our local informant, it is the snakiest part of northern Frederick County. And he has the evidence of that on his porch. The William Patterson Colored School and Outhouse. Rick Smith really wanted to get in this outhouse, and we tried over and over again. One of these days, Rick, we're going to do it. But apparently there's graffiti from the school, from the African American school, in this outhouse. So we really do need to just keep trying, and we will. This is the Halver Patterson house. If you see that photo, the lovely log, it's a log structure. You can see it under the front porch. And the Pattersons, again, this enclave of Pattersonville, which inexplicably has been renamed as Wigville, but it is Pattersonville. The Patterson family had a number of structures here. They started an African American school and just stayed there until they moved, left, and went to Pennsylvania. Our loss. The Buzzard Cemetery. This is an interesting question because some records say that Robert Patterson is buried at the Buzzard Cemetery, which is really quite close to Pattersonville. I guess you'd call it part of Pattersonville. It's part of the Thorpewood property now, and they were very gracious letting us go there and document it. But there's another source that says that Robert's buried at Catoctin Furnace, and we're not sure which is correct. The Robert and Oliver Patterson dwelling, this is an earlier dwelling on the 25 acres that Robert Patterson owned. The structure, the small structure that John showed you and I just showed you, is a later dwelling. This is the earlier dwelling. Rob and I went out with an informant, Willard, Gideon and Gary Willard, and they showed us where this structure was. And they also showed us a mine that has caved in, but is definitely a mine, and it's on state land. So one of these days we'll have to convince the state to allow us to possibly survey it or excavate it, because it most likely has artifacts in it that would date it. The Robert Calamer house is up on the mountain. The owner, the Calamer family is African American, and they own this structure. The owners that have it now didn't want us to fully document it, but it is definitely, Robert was identified as black in the 1900 census, and as a 12-year-old servant in Washington County. It's right on the line, Washington County, Frederick County line. We have some questions about, like, Wolf's Tavern. There's local lore that says that it is a slave catcher was there, and this makes sense, because if you're 6.5 miles from Freedom, you're going up over the mountain, you're going to go right by Wolf's Tavern, which is now a wedding venue. So the John Sanders house will be on the tour today. John Sanders is a really interesting man. Edie found this, and it is this beautiful stone structure. He was enslaved in Frederick County. He purchased his freedom in 1833. He was living as a white man, as a free man with his family in Carroll County. He purchased this stone farmstead on 18 acres in 1849 for $3,300. And then he bought another 18-acre parcel for $600. He moved his family here, and he farmed the land, it's just a beautiful, beautiful farm. This county owns the Daniel Snook Farm, and the Wolf family traces some of its ancestry back to this structure because Calvin Wolf was a farm laborer. There were African Americans here with the Snooks, and Patricia remembers going there when it was owned by the Pitzers. Her grandmother would always be called in to cook the big meals, and Patricia would go with her. Bobby Black told me that his father told him there was an African American gentleman living just in a little very small structure near Catoctin Mountain Orchard. I have the lat long for it, but we haven't been able to find any other information. We don't know who this gentleman was, and unfortunately Bobby Black's father didn't tell him even a first name, but he just said, I remember this gentleman living here on the mountain. So I'm finished, but it was a huge group effort. You can imagine all the people that worked on this, and there they are. I want to just really say a huge thank you to Marilyn Veek, who just ran title search after title search after title search for us to help us find these people. Michael Brandon did a lot of our map work. Edward Quinter translated the Moravian Diaries for us, and Amanda Whitmore with Frederick County, Livable Frederick was a huge part of this as well, as was Arch. So I'm finished, and now we're going to hear one more from Ben Fischler, and then we're going to have lunch.
Morning. While identifying and studying structures and places associated with African American communities in northern Frederick County, this project has revealed information about North County family roots. As an example, this presentation will summarize the information found by the project team about one man, Henry Williams, and his family. During the development of the project context, Edie found information in the 1870 census records that an African-American man named Henry Williams was a landowner in the Mechanicstown election district. This led the team to conduct deed research that identified the houses at 119 and 121 Water Street in Thurmont as owned between 1877 and 1883 by Henry Williams. Henry Williams' purchase of the subject property from John and Emma Rouser was recorded with a deed signed in 1877. This deed noted that John Rouser had purchased this land in 1860 from Samuel Kiefer as part of the purchase of 8 acres of a tract of land called the Hunting Creek Tanning Factory, a tannery that had been in operation for about 30 years, but it just closed down. This deed describes an approximately half-acre parcel with boundaries that can be mapped onto current land ownership maps, as they are here, with the red lines being the 1877 boundaries. This confirms that the two houses at the 119 and 121 Water Street were within the property deeded to Henry Williams in 1877. And the description here of the boundaries begins at the front of his dwelling. That's Henry Williams' dwelling, indicating that there was a house standing and Henry Williams was already living in it before the land was deeded to him. Now, this is just quickly a map. The purple lines are the 8-acre parcel, and the light red shading is Henry Williams' 1877 half-acre deed. On the right is the current. The base map is the current land ownership. On the left is a 1858 map showing that most of the tannery buildings were to the north of Henry's property. Here's 1873 map, so of Mechanicstown in particular, showing Henry Williams down here on Water Street, and this is a blow up showing it here, with also showing how Rouser was subdividing that property and selling it off in smaller parcels. To try to understand the development of the houses themselves better, we took a look at tax assessment records, which are at the original records at Maryland State Archives. The earliest one with Henry Williams was 1866. That's here, assessing him for a house and lot that were off to the right. There are additional columns you don't see that assess the house and lot at $400 and household furniture at $55. Another book, tax assessments from 1867 to 76, had the same initial entry, but then in 1873 noted the lot of ground from John Rouser valued at $90. So that's very close to the price of 106 that was on the 1877 deed, and indicates that there was a transaction with Rouser earlier than 1877. And here's the 1876 assessments, which indicate that between 1873 and 76, Henry Williams built a second house. This says 2 town lots improved with 2 frame houses. And then down here indicates his sale of the north half of that in 1881. And then the sale of the south half, each half with a house on it, in 1883. And there are also deeds that give the same dates for these sales. Here we have a table we put together with census and other records that indicated the age of Henry Williams at different points in his life, then the calculated birth year. And we see that generally the most common from 1870 to 1904 there's 1822. Earlier there were some slightly earlier later birthday years calculated of just a year to 4 years earlier. generally, it seems right here. There's the death certificate in 1904 seems quite off, and that is carried out. We'll see that later on. That was a mistake at the time of the record keeping. So we'll run through these through the deeds, starting in not the deeds, the census records, starting in 1860, which is the earliest one where it's clearly 100% certain that this is the same Henry Williams that and his household that occupied the Water Street houses. The original census records on top, some summary table of ours on the bottom. The 1860 census had Henry as the head of a household, along with 33-year-old Mary, presumably his wife, but the 1860 census did not give relationship of household members to the household head. And 4 children. And it's the two younger children carry through on the 1870 and 80 censuses, which indicates that this whole run of census records are giving us the same Henry Williams. And here in 1863, the next record is from a book of listing all the men who were deemed eligible for the federal draft for the Civil War in 1863. And this is the first few people listed in Mechanicstown. All of them are listed as born in Maryland. Here's Henry Williams, gives him a middle initial of O, and he was listed as a laborer, as he is on most of the censuses. In 1870, again, we have quite a household at that point. There's Henry and Mary Williams, probably just a nickname for Mary, or the other way around, and 5 children. The oldest 2 were ones that were on the 1860 census. The other 3 were born in the 1860s. There were 2 children that were on the 1860 census that aren't here. One of them, the oldest one, Mary, would have been 22 by 1870. So she very likely had already gone off on her own, probably married and moved away, possibly died. In fact, the next oldest, Catherine, apparently did die. We found her on the crowdsourced website of Found a Grave, listed her with as dying in 1868, and with a grave site at the Hill Cemetery adjacent to the United Brethren Church in Thurmont. So they already lost one child at this point. And this next decade with all of these children, it's also the time that Henry built a second house there, although we don't know exactly how it was used. The end of this decade brought a sad period. In 1878 and 79, 3 of Henry's family died. First, his son Marshall, who was on the 1860 and 70 censuses, died in January 1878. And then a year later, in January 1879, Henry's wife, just listed in this newspaper notice as Mrs. Henry Williams, died. And a few months later, in May of 1879, their 14-year-old daughter, Anna May, also died. Leaving in the 1880 census, Henry is a widower with his 3 surviving young children. Both Henry and his son Thaddeus, who was 25 at the time, were listed as laborers, and John as well. So as we saw in the tax records and deeds, Henry sold off his Mechanicstown property in 2 steps, the northern half in 1881 with one house, which is now 119 Water Street, and then the southern half with the other house, now 121 Water Street, in 1883, and the tax assessments show that by noting that his personal property was transferred to the District 2 tax assessment book, and that is actually listed on April 2nd, 1883. And on April 2nd, 83, there's also a deed for Henry purchasing the west half of a brick duplex on West All Saints Street in the city of Frederick. And that's over here, that building with the unpainted brick facing the street here. Henry lived in this house for the remaining 21 years of his life. And he was joined at the end of April 1883 by a new wife. He married Angeline Nichols at the Asbury Methodist Episcopal Church, which was then a building that it was about 1,000 feet further east along All Saints Street. The entirety of All Saints Street is within the historic Frederick Historic District, and the documentation on that historic district notes that the neighborhoods in the city of Frederick were racially segregated until late in the 20th century, and that generally African-American neighborhoods were developed on the outskirts of the downtown area, typically in proximity to industrial areas, which describes West All Saints Street, and that West All Saints Street was historically the center of the African-American community and the commercial buildings associated. So while during those 21 years in Frederick City, Henry was very community active, and here there are a number of 1890s newspaper clippings showing how he was an officer in the Frederick County Emancipation Society, which held annual celebrations of Emancipation Day in the Frederick City. And then here it shows that he was an officer in the local Kilpatrick Post number 34 of the Grand Army of the Republic, GAR, which was a fraternal society of Civil War veterans. Although we have no indication that Henry actually served in the war, he was a little bit old and had a large family to support. He probably was not drafted and didn't volunteer, but helped with this fraternal society as well. Anyway, in the 1900 census, Henry and Angeline are there in the same house with an elderly boarder. Angeline had a lifelong history of work history of caretaking, and so that would explain that boarder probably. There are a number of mistakes in the on this page of the census. They list Henry as being 18 years old, but married for 17 years. So that seems a little off, and I think they actually meant that he was 78 years old, which fits with all the rest of the data we have. Angeline died in August of 1903, and with Henry died 13 months later. Here we have Angeline's obituary over here, and Henry's over here, and Henry's death certificate, which one of his 3 surviving children, Amy, provided the information for. Although she got his age wrong, it's listed here as 62, and again, that just doesn't fit the rest of the information, including the gravestone here, which lists Henry's birth in 1822. That fits with most of the records. Angeline and Henry were buried at Greenmount Cemetery, which was located downtown Frederick. It was one of the 3 cemeteries in the city where people of color could be buried. But in 1920, the Greenmount Cemetery was sold to a hospital, what's now a hospital, and within a few years, many but not all of the graves at Greenmount were moved to Fairview Cemetery, a graveyard purchased in 1923 by a committee of local African Americans. That the gravestone is here. It suggests that Henry and Angeline's remains were actually moved. Between just a few months after Angeline's death, Henry prepared a will, and that's over here on the right. The main asset was his house there on West All Saints Street. He left the house and all the rest of his personal and Nick's property to his daughter Amy. His death notice had noted that he was survived by one daughter and two sons, and it's for Amy's use during her natural life, and then um, left it to be divided after her death between his two surviving sons, Thaddeus and John, or their heirs if they died earlier. So Thaddeus did die in 1910, which Amy died in 1913. There was Thaddeus's heirs and John's family had asked the court to help with the division of the property. John ended up buying this house, but then selling it after he moved to Washington, D.C. sometime before 1920. So we looked into the descendants of Henry, and these of these three, Amy never married, and we have no indication that she had any children. Thaddeus and his wife Hattie had 5 children, one of whom, Thomas Williams, had a daughter named Marquise Williams, and she married Charles Shern, and they have an abundant descendants, both in Frederick and around the country, and we've been in touch with some of them, and really appreciate the exchange of information and discussion about the family. And then the younger surviving son, John Williams, as I said, he and his wife Martha moved to Washington, D.C. and sometime before 1920 census, between 1910 and 20. They had a son and a daughter. Their son was a World War I veteran and is buried at the Arlington National Cemetery, and an adopted daughter as well. We have not found any indication that there are living descendants of John, though. So at this point, we've kind of switched to our temporal direction here. We've been going on a timeline from Henry up toward the present now, and we hit the present. So we're going to switch back around and go backwards from the 1860 census, where we know that we have Henry and his family, into his younger years and his ancestry. This is a death certificate for Henry's daughter, Amy, who died in 1913, and her sister-in-law, Mrs. John Williams, down here, provided the information on the here, and including that Amy's parents were Henry O. Williams, as we know, and the maiden name of her mother is listed as Airy Johnson. So that's an intriguing piece of information, but we haven't been able to come up with any solid information about more information about Henry's earlier wife from that yet, but it's promising. So, and when we look here, we've been looking at Henry up here in Thurmont, and then he moved down to Frederick, which is well below, out of the range of this map. But several records dating to the 1840s and 50s show that there was a Henry Williams who was a resident in the Lewistown area in those years. Lewistown is about 6 miles south of Thurmont, so in the general vicinity. But there are 2 documents from the mid 1840s that indicate that Henry that set down roots in Lewistown during his young adulthood, buying a lot in the town in 1845, and at some time before July of 1846, marrying an enslaved woman named Ruth Thomas. In the first of these documents, dated October 17th, 1845, Henry purchased a 16-foot by 30-foot part of lot 146 in Lewistown from a local free black couple named Ephraim and Miranda Richardson. And so It's not clear when he sold it. There's no deeds recorded for that. There is an indication that it was at least before 1869. The second record is interesting. Henry waited almost a year to record his deed with the county courthouse for that small piece of lot 146. When he did record this deed on August 1st, 1846, he also recorded a bill of sale dated July of 1846, in which he paid Daniel Rouser $55 for Ruth Thomas's remaining term of enslavement. And this, the bill of sale here is hard to read, so there's a transcription down here. But essentially, what it's saying is that Daniel Rouser had intended to keep Ruth Thomas enslaved until she turned 28. But at this point, she had a little under 6 years remaining, and he is by this document selling those years of her enslavement to her husband Henry Williams. So, which is not unheard of and very very interesting, but oops. But while this bill of sale clearly records that, we found no further record of Ruth Thomas or her marriage to Henry Williams. So the 1850 census listed Henry Williams as residing in Lewistown within a household headed by a free black man named Hillary Norris. We're not sure whether Henry was a relative or a boarder. The census doesn't indicate it. In 1852, Henry Williams purchased a house on a quarter-acre portion of Lot 103 in Lewistown, and in 1861, he and his wife, Ari, sold that property to another free black couple. Various situations could explain this chronology and these records. Ruth may have changed her name after gaining her freedom to Ari or Mary, or she may have died or left the area. We just don't know at this point. But given this possible connection, probable connection to Lewistown, we looked at we're looking back into his childhood. Since Henry was, we have the majority of the documents indicate that Henry was born in 1822. So we looked at 1830 and 1840 censuses. And we have a pretty good guess here that in Lewistown in 1830, there was a household headed by Rachel Williams. And this before 1850, only the head of the household was listed in the census, and there were numbers of people in various categories and age ranges. But Rachel was the head of a household with two males under 10, one of which would be Henry at that time. He would have been 8 years old. Herself, which she was given all the details, she would have been in her early 20s, and over here, and then a male between 55 and 100, probably an elderly relative, but we really can't say for sure. Then 1840, she's not there as a head of household, but there's a household headed by Benjamin Williams that includes a female of the right age to be Rachel, and a male, the right age, a male of a similar age, in his between 36 and under 55, and two males that are between 10 and 23, and Henry would fit there, as well as a female under 10. So we were thinking that perhaps Benjamin and Rachel are Henry's parents. We didn't find Benjamin and Rachel in the 1850 census, but in the 1860 census, there is a household in Frederick County District 2, which is the city, Frederick City and the surrounding rural areas, and with Benjamin and Rachel with ages that fit, and a woman named Jane who was 20 at the time. So we do know that there was a free black couple, Benjamin and Rachel, and it would look here like he was he was free in 1840, but not in 1830. So we looked at the manumissions and found that Ben Williams was manumitted in 1839, along with 4 other people who were enslaved by a Joseph P. Fleming. So there are various reasons why there's a possibility of another Benjamin Williams, who was in the 1840 census for District 2. So we're not 100% sure that this would be Henry's possible father, but there it is. And the Fleming farm was about 6 miles south of Lewistown, so not an easy life, but certainly not unknown in marriages between free and enslaved people at that time. So, oops. Then and going back further, Joseph P. Fleming's father, Joseph, died in 1822, and the inventory of his personal property in 1823 included a Negro man named Ben. Among the enslaved people, and the Fleming family were enslavers back another generation before that, at least, when they came to Frederick from Pennsylvania in the 1750s. So there's some intriguing possibilities there about Henry's ancestry, and a lot more information about his life and his descendants. And just leave everyone with thought that we've gained a lot by communicating with the descendants, and with and just working with the records. And I think there's a lot of other examples from this project where there's a lot to be gained from open communication and discussion and sharing information. So I hope we can continue that and fill out this picture some more for the whole area. Okay. Thank you very much.